Imagine waking up to find that the commercial eyes in the sky have suddenly gone blind, all to protect you from a hidden high-tech alliance.
I mean, it sounds exactly like science fiction, right? But that blackout is actually happening right above our heads.
Welcome to this deep dive. We're jumping straight into, well, a really explosive geopolitical shift that totally dominated the first quarter of 2026.
Yeah, we have a massive stack of intelligence assessments, think tank reports, and, industry leaks to get through today.
Exactly. So let's just get right into the breakdown. Back in February 2026, the U.S. and Israel launched these joint strikes against Iran.
Right, and those strikes were completely unprecedented. They actually resulted in the death of Iran's supreme leader.
Which, as you can imagine, triggered an immediate retaliation. Iran fired right back at U.S. bases in the Middle East, injuring American troops.
But the fallout from those strikes, as massive as it is, isn't actually the most shocking part. The detail that completely changes how we look at modern warfare happened behind the scenes.
Right before the missiles even launched, Ukrainian President Zelensky, along with U.S. intelligence agencies, they released these findings, claiming that Russia acted as the spotter for the Iranian military.
Yeah, essentially using Russian military satellites to feed Iran the exact pinpoint coordinates of American assets.
Now, before we go any further, we have to state clearly that our sources show a really sharp divide on this here at home.
A very sharp divide, yeah.
The U.S. administration is completely split. The intelligence agencies declassified these findings for the public, but President Trump dismissed the reports entirely.
He basically stated that Russian intelligence makes absolutely no difference in Iran's ability to strike, and that, peace with Moscow is still achievable.
Right, and our goal today is not to take a political side on that divide. We are looking strictly at the data. We want to understand the actual mechanics of what U.S. intelligence is claiming happened.
Because regardless of the political debate in Washington, this intelligence leak triggered an absolute earthquake in the private sector.
Oh, massive. Commercial satellite companies took action that we have literally never seen before.
Yeah. Planet Labs and Vantor, which you might remember them by their old name, Maxar. They placed a strict 14-day delay on all new imagery of the Middle East.
They literally blacked out the map. And I mean, delaying that imagery by 2 weeks represents a huge financial hit for these companies.
Oh, absolutely. They sell real-time data. That is their whole business model.
Exactly. So they wouldn't just hamstring their own product unless the info Russia was supposedly feeding Iran was creating an immediate catastrophic threat to allied forces.
Which brings us to today's mission. We're pulling apart this Russia-Iran defense axis to see how a relationship that started as a total partnership of equals has flipped into this desperate dependency.
Yeah, we're going to keep it accessible, but look at the hard numbers. The phrase Axis of Upheaval gets thrown around a lot, right? Russia, China, North Korea, Iran.
Right, but Russia's specific role right now is really unique. They're not putting boots on the ground in the Middle East.
No, their contribution is data. So let's explore that data transfer. The sources detail how Russia actively surveyed very specific locations for Iran.
We're talking about the U.S. Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia, for one.
And the British-American base on Diego Garcia, which, I mean, that sits 3,800 kilometers away in the remote Indian Ocean.
It's incredibly isolated. It's where the U.S. stages its B-2 and B-52 bombers.
So how does a map from a Russian satellite actually help an Iranian missile travel 3,800 kilometers to hit a bomber?
Well, it all comes down to bypassing electronic warfare.
Okay, break that down for us.
Sure. So when an adversarial missile approaches a U.S. base, American defense systems don't just fire interceptor missiles. They use intense electronic jamming.
Like to confuse the missile's onboard radar?
Exactly. They basically scramble its internal compass. But if Russia hands Iran highly classified three-dimensional geospatial intelligence beforehand—
and early warning radar data, right?
Right. Then the Iranian missile doesn't even need to rely on its own sensors, the ones that get jammed so easily.
It's kind of like a video game. Imagine you're playing, and suddenly another player gets a radar hack from a friend outside the game.
That's a great analogy, actually.
Right. It forces the game developers to just fog up the entire map for everyone just to keep the players safe. The missile essentially flies blind, following a pre-programmed invisible wire right to the target.
Precisely. And furthermore, this Russian data lets Iran conduct really precise battle damage assessments.
Which they couldn't do before, right? Because in previous conflicts, Iran's independent targeting was pretty inaccurate.
Highly inaccurate. They'd fire a volley, and the missiles would miss or just get intercepted. And without high-resolution satellites, Iran had no way of knowing what went wrong.
But Russian data completely changes that math.
It does. Russia can literally tell Iran if a U.S. Patriot missile battery moves, say, 500 yards down the road. They map the exact blind spots in the U.S. radar coverage.
Wow, so it acts like a digital backdoor in a closed system. U.S. forces build these defense networks assuming the enemy can't see over the horizon.
But Russia essentially hands Iran a pair of night vision goggles.
Which, again, forces companies like Planet Labs to fog up the commercial map. Because if that commercial data is out there, adversaries can just scrape it.
Yeah, they combine it with the Russian military data, and they create a lethally accurate picture of troop movements.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit. Because if Russia is handing over this level of classified high-value data, they must owe Iran big time.
You'd think so, yeah. And that points us back to the history of this alliance, which has completely transformed since 2022.
Because back in 2022 and 2023, the power dynamic was entirely reversed. Russia was the desperate partner.
Absolutely. Russia was bogged down in Ukraine, and they were burning through munitions at just an unsustainable rate.
Right, they had the cash, they had the advanced fighter jets, but they lacked cheap, mass-produced drones.
So Iran stepped in. Starting in 2021, they supplied over $4 billion worth of arms to Moscow.
$4 billion. That includes thousands of those infamous Shahed 136 drones, right?
Yeah, the Delta Wing ones. See, Iran had spent decades under crippling international sanctions.
So they were forced to perfect the art of building cheap, explosive drones out of basically commercial parts.
Exactly. And they traded that massive inventory to Russia. But crucially, they didn't just trade the drones, they transferred the production technology.
And that exchange, which looked like a partnership of equals back then, has totally shifted. Fast forward to 2026, and the statistics reveal a completely different reality.
Yeah, because Russia localized that technology. They built their own massive manufacturing centers.
The Alabuga facility, right. The sources project that Russia will produce 32,000 drones annually by 2030, all inside their own borders.
32,000 a year. They took Iran's tech and scaled it to a massive industrial level.
Wait, so if I understand this correctly, the student has basically become the master.
That's a perfect way to put it, yeah. The great irony is that by helping Russia survive its crisis in 2022, Iran accidentally made itself expendable.
They gave away the blueprints.
They did. And we see that expendability in Russia's broader supply chain today. Russia diversified. They rely heavily on North Korea now.
Right. Current Ukrainian intelligence estimates say North Korea supplies over half of the artillery shells Russia fires in Ukraine.
Half. Plus short-range ballistic missiles. And concurrently, Russia is importing critical microchips and engine components directly from China.
So Iran's status as the indispensable military supplier just evaporated.
It did. And while Russia was becoming self-sufficient, Iran basically walked into a buzzsaw.
Right. The reports
A
heavily
single vote in
reference
the U.S. Senate can freeze the most powerful government on Earth.
And then the massive
But right now,
February
a
2026
political
conflict we talked
standoff
about
threatens
earlier.
to blow up the rules forever. Israel severely
we are watching the
degraded
fundamental
Iran's air
machinery
defense
of
networks.
American
They
lawmaking.
systematically
just
dismantled their missile
grind
production
to an
sites.
Yeah.
absolute halt.
Analysts
And
call
honestly,
this
the physical
growing
toll on the
strategic
people inside that
asymmetry.
building is about to
The
become very
geopolitical
real.
pendulum swung
Right, so let's set
completely
the
in the
scene.
other direction. It's March
So
2026.
Russia secured its supply lines,
Picture the
while
hallways
Iran's
of the
strategic
United States
vulnerability
Capitol
hit a
right now.
critical peak.
Aides are
Iran
literally
requires
dragging
massive immediate
military-style
assistance
cots
just to
into
rebuild its
back
basic
offices.
defenses.
Oh, yeah.
They depend on
Staffers
Russia
are
now.
stockpiling
Far more
energy
than
drinks
Russia
by the
depends on them.
case.
Exactly.
Okay,
We're
so
looking at a
if
scenario where
Iran's
senators might
military
actively
infrastructure
refuse
is
to
basically
drink
smoke
water
and craters,
just so they don't have to
and
leave
they
the floor to
desperately
use the
need a
restroom.
shield.
Which is wild.
What
and it's all
exactly
because
are
the
they asking
Senate
Moscow
is
to
completely
provide?
deadlocked
At the
over
absolute
the Save
top of their
America
shopping
Act.
list
Right, that
are
big election
advanced
overhaul
Russian
bill.
air
Yeah.
defense
It's centered
systems.
around measures like
Specifically,
voter ID
the
requirements.
S-400.
To replace
Democrats
the
are
older
aggressively blocking
radars
this
that failed to
legislation,
stop the
and
Israeli
Republicans
strikes,
desperately
Exactly.
They need
want
those
but
sophisticated
they lack
surface-to-air
the
missile
60
batteries.
votes required to break
Second,
the stalemate.
they are still
Which
waiting on
means
deliveries
frustrations
of
are
advanced
just
Su-35
boiling over.
fighter jets.
Today,
Yeah,
you
we've
have
seen reports
28
of those jet
Republican
deals for
senators,
years,
people like
but
Pete
the
Ricketts
planes
and
never
Cynthia
seem to
Lummis,
materialize, and the actual
demanding
numbers
that the
Iran
Senate
needs
force
to,
a grueling,
contest its own
physical,
airspace.
talking filibuster. But
They
a
want to
defensive
force
shield is only
Democrats
half
to
the
stand on the
equation
floor and
The
talk
sources
until their
indicate
vocal
Iran
cords
also
just give
wants
out.
Russian
And if that
engineering
fails,
assistance
they want
for
to
a
break the
major
standing
offensive
rules of the
upgrade.
Senate
They want to build
entirely
missiles
to force a
capable of
final
flying
vote.
3,800
And the real shocker dropped
kilometers.
just
Which
a few
brings
days
us
ago.
right back to
Senator
Diego
John
Garcia.
Cornyn,
Right,
a man who
because currently,
fiercely defended
Iran
the old
limits its
Senate
own
rules for his
ballistic missile
entire
range
career,
to roughly
just
2,000
published
kilometers.
this fiery
Which covers
op-ed.
the Middle
Right,
East,
saying
sure.
Republicans must
But
act
it
now
leaves
to get
those
this
B-2
bill
bombers
passed.
in
Yeah,
the
he
Indian
said they had to
Ocean
deal
safely
effectively
out
out
of
of
the
reach.
rules.
And extending that
which
range
instantly
to
triggered a massive
3,800
public
kilometers,
call-out
well,
from
that's
former
not just a
Senator
matter
Joe
of
Manchin.
slapping a larger fuel
Manchin
tank
slammed
on a
Cornyn
rocket.
online
Not
for,
at all. Well,
it requires
a massive
overcoming
flip-flop.
massive
Because the rules of the
engineering
Senate are
hurdles.
quite literally hanging by a
specifically
thread right
involving
now. I mean, the
solid
decisions made in the
propellant
next
rocket
few days
motors
will
and
dictate how
re-entry
American laws
vehicles.
are written
Let's
for the
break
next
down the
century.
chemistry and physics
Welcome
of that
to
for
this
a second,
deep dive.
because the difference between
Today, we
liquid
have
and
a
solid
custom mission
propellant
tailored just for
explains
you.
why Iran
We're
can't
going to
do this
explore
alone.
the
It's a crucial distinction,
swashbuckling,
yeah.
pirate-filled
If you build
origins
a
of the
massive
filibuster.
liquid-fueled
It is a crazy
rocket,
history.
you
It
have
really
to fuel
is.
it right there on
We'll
the
also
launch
break
pad.
down the
Right, which
terrifying
takes
parliamentary
hours.
weapon
Exactly.
known as
The
the
fuel is
nuclear
highly
option.
corrosive, it's volatile,
And finally, we will
and in a
unpack
modern war zone,
mind-bending
a missile
mathematical
just sitting on a
concept
launch pad for
called
3
the
hours is a
Mansion
sitting duck.
paradox.
Right,
Oh, absolutely.
which proves exactly
Israeli
why politicians
or
use
US jets
gridlock
would
as a
blow it to
highly
pieces
calculated
before it ever leaves the ground.
mathematical
Yeah, so
strategy.
solid fuel
So,
solves that
by
vulnerability.
the end of this
It does.
conversation,
A solid
you
fuel
will
rocket
hold the
comes
secret
preloaded.
decoder ring
You can store it in a
for the
tunnel,
chaos
roll it
you
out on
see
a
on the
mobile
news.
launcher,
You
fire
will
it in
understand
minutes,
the
and hide
hidden
the
game
launcher
theory
again.
But
that drives these
manufacturing
high-stakes
solid
showdowns.
fuel that burns
Absolutely.
perfectly
Okay, let's unpack
evenly
this.
for 300
Before we can truly
kilometers
grasp the
without
physical
creating
threats and the massive stakes
air
of
pockets
this
that cause the rocket
2026
to
FZV
explode in
America
midair,
Act
that takes
standoff,
incredibly
we
advanced
really need to look at what the
metallurgy.
filibuster
advanced
actually
chemical
is.
cast.
And more importantly,
which
how
is
it
the exact
started.
engineering
Right,
mastery
because it wasn't
that Russia
designed this way by the
possesses.
founders,
Iran
right?
wants
Like this
that
wasn't in the
technical
blueprint.
know-how. Not at all.
They
If you read the
They
U.S.
also need
Constitution,
advanced
you will
satellite
not find the word
navigation components
filibuster
to ensure
anywhere
a
in the
warhead
text.
going
Wow,
that far
nowhere.
actually hits a runway.
The Constitution
Plus,
basically gives
advanced
the
heat
Senate the
shielding so
authority
it
to set its
survives
own internal
re-entering
rules.
the atmosphere.
So back in
That is a
1789,
terrifying
during the very
technological
first
leap.
sessions,
Iran
debates
basically
ended
wants
with
the
just a
ultimate
simple majority
offensive and
vote.
defensive
Okay,
package.
so 51
But what
votes
does
and
Russia
you're done.
actually want in
Exactly.
return at this
But
point?
there
You said
was
they
this
build their own
massive
drones
loophole.
now. They
Well,
never
Russia's shopping list
codified
is
a
definitely
specific
shrinking,
procedure to
but they
force
do
a
have niche
vote to
requirements.
happen
They
if
really
someone
want
simply
Iran's
refused to
newer
stop talking.
jet-powered
Ah.
drones.
Like the Shahid 238.
So without a mechanism to cut out
Those
debate,
models replace the old propeller
politicians
engines
figured
with
out they could
small
just,
jets,
hold
making them
the
way
floor
faster and
hostage.
significantly
did.
harder for
We
Ukrainian
actually
air
have
defenses
diaries
to
from the
shoot
very
down.
The
first
reports
session
also
of the
mentioned the
Senate.
FAT 3
Pennsylvania
60
Senator William
close-range
McClay
ballistic
wrote down his
missiles.
sheer
Right,
frustration
Iran
that
already
senators
delivered
from
around 200
Virginia
of
were
those to Russia.
intentionally
They're
talking away
tactical
the
missiles,
clock.
just
meant
to make
for
sure
frontline
specific build
bombardment.
couldn't
But
pass.
again, even
Right,
with those
they
deliveries,
literally
Russia is
weaponized the
increasingly
clock.
turning to
I mean,
China
if they were
for the
holding the
cheap
legislative
components
process
to build their
hostage,
own
it makes
weapons.
perfect
So
sense
the
why the press
relationship is still
eventually started calling them
transactional,
pirates.
but the currency
Which
is
brings us to
completely
the
changed.
actual
Okay,
word
here's where it gets really
filibuster.
interesting.
Yeah, it's easily
in
one of the
January
strangest words in
2025,
American politics.
the
So where
Russian
does it
and
come
Iranian
from?
presidents
The
signed
etymology
a
is fascinating,
20-year
honestly. The term really took hold in the
comprehensive strategic partnership
1850s.
treaty.
It comes
Yes,
from the
they
Dutch
formalized
word
the alliance
freebooter
on paper.
and the
It
Spanish
was a
word
massive
filibustero.
diplomatic
Which
spectacle.
translates
Wait, so
directly
if
to
I'm
freebooter
tracking
or
this
pirate,
timeline,
right?
Yes.
they signed this
Specifically,
massive 20-year
the
alliance
mercenaries
in
and
2025,
pirates who
Just
raided
1 year
Caribbean
later, in
islands
February
and Latin American
2026,
countries
Iran
during
gets
that
attacked.
era.
Right.
So they were
Their
calling
supreme
these
leader is
distinguished
killed, their bases
senators
are hit.
pirates.
If
Pretty
Iran is
much.
practically begging
The
for
term
an air
entered
defense
the political
shield, and they have
lexicon
this
because
freshly signed
observers
20-year
recognized
treaty,
the behavior.
why didn't Russia scramble
Senators
its
who
own
talked
fighter
for
jets to
hours
defend
were
Iranian
literally
airspace?
hijacking
That's a
the
great
Senate
question.
floor.
Like
Like
why
taking
did
the
they
government
only send
hostage, just like a
satellite
pirate
data?
taking over
It
a
feels
ship.
like Russia takes the weapons
So
but
let's
leaves
track how
Iran
the
out
Senate
to dry
tried
when
to
the
fight off
shooting
these
actually
legislative
starts.
pirates. And that highlights the
Because
most
as the country
critical
grew,
limitation of
you
this
couldn't just
entire
have one
dynamic.
person shut down the
treaty
entire
is a
government for weeks
strategic
on end.
partnership.
No, you couldn't.
It
But
is
it took a long time to build a defense.
not
By the
a
early
mutual
20th
defense
century,
alliance.
these marathon
like
speeches
NATO's
became
Article 5.
catastrophic
Exactly.
for a
With Article
modernizing
5,
nation.
an attack on one
So
member
finally, in
legally requires
1917,
all other
President
members to
Woodrow
go to
Wilson
war.
pushed the Senate
The
to adopt
Russia-Iran
Rule
Treaty
22.
contains no such clause.
This rule
So
created
Russia
a
acts
formal
as an
process
arms
called
dealer
cloture
and
Cloture,
an intelligence
okay.
broker,
which is
but
simply a
they
mechanism to
absolutely
force an end to
refused
debate.
to act as a
But
bodyguard.
here's the
Right.
catch.
Russia
It required
calculates
a
its risks
massive
based
two-thirds
entirely on its
majority
own
vote to
grand
trigger.
strategy.
2/3, wow.
And
Which
their
is an
strategy
incredibly
centers on
steep
winning
hill
the
to
war
climb.
in Ukraine
So
and
stiff
confronting
that
the
over
West
the
in
next
Europe.
4
So
decades,
Moscow is
the
perfectly
Senate
happy to
only
sell
managed to
advanced weapons to
successfully
Tehran.
invoke cloture
They're more than
5
willing to
times.
provide
That
geospatial
is
data that
wild.
makes life
Yeah.
dangerous for the
Southern
United
senators
States.
famously
But they
used
will
this
not
exact
risk a
tool
direct
to block
physical war
civil
in the
rights
Middle East.
legislation
Because
for
sending
years.
Russian pilots to
The
shoot
gridlock
down
grew so
American
intense
or
that
Israeli
in
jets over
1975,
Tehran pulls
Senate
resources
lowered that
away
threshold
from their main
from
goal.
two-thirds
down to
Exactly.
60
They will
out of
slide
the
the night vision
100
goggles
total
across
senators.
the table, but they absolutely refuse to
And that
pick up
60
rifle
vote
and step
threshold
into the
is the
room
number
with you.
that dominates our
Wow.
politics today.
Exactly.
That cold,
But here's where I think a
pragmatic
lot of people get
calculation
confused.
really defines
When we hear the word
this modern
filibuster,
Russia,
we don't
Iran
just think of a
axis.
60-vote
It's an
math
alliance
problem.
of convenience.
We picture
Driven
Jimmy
by
Stewart in
immediate
Mr.
mutual
Smith Goes to
hostility toward
Washington.
the West.
Right,
Yeah.
the classic movie
Rather
scene.
than any
Yeah,
deep
we picture a
ideological
single person
loyalty.
standing
And
at a
this
podium,
uneven
reading
power
the phone book,
dynamic,
sweating,
it bleeds
refusing to sit
directly
down.
into our everyday
But
lives,
senators
far
rarely
beyond
do
just the
that anymore.
battlefields of
Why don't they have to
2026.
physically
It really
talk
does.
today?
The
That
technical
is a
data
crucial
Russia
piece
feeds
of the
to
puzzle.
Iran trickles
So,
down to
in the
Iranian proxy
1970s,
groups.
the Senate
Right,
created
like
something
when
called
highly
the
accurate
two-track
targeting
system.
data
Two-track
reaches
system.
groups
How
like
did
the
that work?
Houthis.
Well,
It
before the
directly
system, a
disrupts
filibuster
international
stopped
shipping in
all
the Red
Senate
Sea.
business
Commercial
completely.
traders have to
nothing
reroute
else could
around the
happen.
entire continent
The
of
Senate
Africa.
realized they had
Which
a whole
spiked
country
global
to run,
energy
so they changed the
prices.
procedure.
It raises
Makes
the
sense.
cost of consumer
Under the
goods
new
for all of
system,
you
if a
listening.
senator simply
And most
threatened
critically,
to
it elevates
filibuster
the
a bill,
immediate threat
the
level
Senate
for
leadership would just
US
set that
military
controversial
personnel
bill aside
deployed
on a different
overseas.
track
We are
and move
looking
on
at a
to
highly
other
fragile
business.
geopolitical framework.
So they
right
made
now.
it painless.
Russia's
You didn't have to
domestic
stand
drone
up and
factories
destroy
are
your
running
local
at full
courts anymore. You
capacity.
just sent an
Their
email
artillery
saying,
supply lines from
I
North Korea
object,
are
and the
locked
bill
in.
was frozen.
Their component pipeline
Like
from
a silent
China remains
filibuster.
robust.
You capture the
As
dynamic
time moves
perfectly.
forward,
The
Russia's
physical
practical
endurance
need for
requirement
Iranian
basically
military exports
vanished.
is approaching zero.
But the physical
Which
records
leaves
from
us with
before
a
and
critical
outside that
unknown
silent
for you to
system,
mull over.
those remain
We
pretty
have a
legendary.
highly
absolutely.
vulnerable,
Strom Thurmond
deeply
spoke against the
isolated
Civil
Iran
Rights Act
in
in
Their air
1957
defenses are
for
shattered.
24 hours
Their
and 18
economy
minutes.
is
Imagine finding out you're
24
electric
hours.
bill.
If Tehran
The modern
suddenly
individual
realizes
records
that
will
its
massive
biggest
spending
global
addiction.
protector,
It does.
a partner
In
in
shocking
April
realization when you
2025,
actually look at the
Booker
numbers.
spoke
Right.
for an
Well,
astonishing
imagine for a
25
second
hours
that
and
you
5
have
minutes
savings
against
account.
the policies of the
And
Donald Trump administration.
You
I mean, just
afford
think
your
about the
family
bodily
hand over
reality.
heart
Do they
25
pivot
hours.
entirely
This
toward
money
China
was
and
strictly
sit
for
down
control
and
of their
you cannot
energy
lean
sector
on your
in
desk.
You can't even leave the
If you
chamber
don't
for
fix
the
this
fact
roof,
that conventional
it is the
alliances
house's
offer no
brutal,
dual protection. It's an
dangerous
existential
test
crisis
for the
finalizing
House.
their
Exactly.
own
It's
nuclear
to
weapons
save the house
program.
fund.
It really
At a
reminds
very
you of
self-preservation
Your car
level.
breaks down.
The balance of
Spend
power
who decides
gradually
gradually
over
over
the
the
last
last
bills
yank
piling
the
up.
emergency
And so what do
brake
you do?
conditions are
Everyone
getting
else
sent
into
for
the
another
walls just
massive
because
Take
they
that
don't
money,
like the
pay off
final
your
destination.
questioning the underlying
It is a
motives behind
highly
the
disruptive maneuver.
And look for how
Wait,
all these
that raises
supply
the
chains
glaring
are
question, though.
The
The
roof is
commercial eyes in the
cool
sky
is
might have
so
gone dark
universally
because of
disruptive.
maps,
And
but the
the car is a
intelligence
majority
still growing.
self-inflicted
absolutely hates it.
Thank you for joining us on this
$1.5
deep
billion
dive.